must be skeptical of absolutely everything. Above all, this is a war of propaganda.
Let's talk about the speed with which we are watching this market deteriorate.
We only need to use the word faith when there isn't any evidence.
I presume you've got faith in your wife. Is there any evidence for that?
Yes, plenty of evidence. I
strongly resist the idea that archaeology is a science. These days, academics are driven by the need to publish research papers.
Now, of course I am minimising my tax, and if anybody in this country doesn't minimise their tax, I want their heads ripped. Because as a government, I can tell you, you're not spending it that well that we should be donating extra.
The easy answer is this. If we continue to send our children to Caesar for their education, we need to stop being surprised when they come home as Romans.
Welcome to Fringe Frequencies. I'm Cody.
And I'm Jason.
And we are joined tonight by a very wonderful guest. Colin has come on to share his story with us to some degree and discuss with us the growing subject of vaccine injuries. I'm sure Colin, maybe you saw it, but I'm not sure if you saw it, Jace. There was there's class action starting in Australia against I don't know specifically if it's Moderna or if it's Pfizer, but there are class actions starting.
It'll be the federal government. Yep. The largest payout so far in Australia is 2.5 million to one applicant against the federal government, not TGA, the federal government.
Wow. Okay.
That's thus far. But we all know that it's the taxpayer who foots the bill.
Yeah. Wow.
So we were always the guinea pigs and the collateral, and also the you could say the what do they call it, the guarantee when you get a loan, so to speak. But anyway, so Colin Gaskin is from our church. Why are you
doxing him, man? Why are you doxing him?
Huh?
No, I'm just kidding.
But what is doxing, man? I'm 41.
Doxing is when you reveal someone's details online. Usually with malicious intent.
Well, are we gonna do that, like all the fuzzy lines on the face?
I'm gonna black out not only his surname, but I'm also gonna put Wade's voice over his name.
You know the great thing about this conversation was having is the only person that really matters is God's opinion. So
yeah, amen.
Yeah.
Colin, please introduce yourself. Let us know who you are and as we've discussed prior to the podcast, give us a little bit of a story behind your walk with the Lord, if that's okay, and we'll get into it.
All right, probably the starting point is the reality for me is that I'm now an 80-year-old, almost 81. For the last 6+ years, I've been living with a diagnosis of Parkinson's and finding the implication of what that means. I have a very rich blessing in my background as I've worked in various areas of social work, children, alcoholics, homeless people. Had the privilege of being in responsible positions and seeing a lot of things taking place. And then had 14 wonderful years simply reading the Bible on the street in the city of Melbourne. And I'm reminded as I say that, one day a lady came across the road and said, "Carly, we need you here." My wife Carly said to me, tried to engage her in conversation, I go catch my tram. I just want to tell you, we need you here. And Carly's response was, "We're doing this while the opportunity is here. You couldn't have done that in the last 3 years. You wouldn't have been allowed to." And you may not have got away with it in the period immediately before. But I've had the richness of that opportunity of being called as a young man to serve God. Met a young lady in training college, became my wife, and for her joy and blessing, she's gone to be with the Lord, so that's her enrichment. My heartache is her loss from my presence. Been very blessed, family, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. My health walk over the years has been variable. I've had, for From the time I was a teenager, 18 years of age, I was going to doctors trying to find out why does my back hurt. And learning very early in the piece that if you want to maintain physical function, you need to do something. It's not just medications. You need to exercise. You need to know the appropriate exercises. You need to be willing to do it. And I think of what I've done over the years. On one stage, they want to put me in a back brace. I said, no, I'm not having that. Put me in a back brace, my muscles will deteriorate, and I'm finished. So I didn't do that. So I've hung from monkey bars, swung from trees, done exercises and various other things along the way. And as I say, had a very full and rich life. All in connection with opportunity to working with people. The biggest single chunk was with children. It was about almost 20 years. And then with alcoholics, with homeless men, then church ministry, and then onto the streets. So all that's been very wonderful. My wife died with cancer back in last year. That was a 13-month run. Yeah, excuse me, I just got to keep myself under control. 13-month run with cancer, but I had determined she wasn't going into care. I mean, that was during the lockdown and visitation was difficult. We weren't vaxxed. That proved to be a complication in that period of time too. So I did that at home, and the palliative care people were simply wonderful and gave me the support, made sure I knew what I was getting into. And the doctor came to see me twice from the service, and to make sure I understood what I would have to deal with. When she was satisfied that I understood, she was saying, "That's fine, we'll support you." And learning to walk that road and going through it, and I have one picture, which is probably an odd picture to have still up, but it's a picture of my wife towards the end, in bed and not communicating very much. I just sitting by the side of the bed, and it just reminds me of the privilege of being in a relationship where your love for one another is real. It's not a fairy tale, it's not something in the background, it's a reality of life. And I didn't have that there when she first died, but I found it and made a copy and put it up. It just reminds me again. But that's all part of the enrichment of that. I mean, in terms of dealing with where I'm at these days, I believe I'm still here for a reason. I haven't just simply outlived my wife. That was my prayer. Dear God, let me outlive my wife. Now, I believe that's what I needed to do. I needed to be able to take care of her. In those early years when we worked in social arms of the Salvation Army, demands on my time were enormous. And so much she carried on her own, bearing children, supporting me in ministry, and those sorts of things. And I felt that that latter part of her life, this was payback time. My time to take care of her. And what a blessing it is to be able to walk with somebody you love to a situation when you understand physically they're not going to recover from this. And to walk through that and to be able to love one another and to sense the love of God in the context of that. And I'm so grateful that I have a hope. And a hope is, as our marriage was in Christ Jesus, and for us it was a three-way marriage, Jesus Christ and myself and Carly. And I still have that love. We used to sign, I'm reading letters at the moment, and these days most people won't have access to this because you're using your phones and other things. I got letters that are 58 years old of about a 12-month period where we were virtually still courting each other and to the stages of engagement and approval for getting permission to get, and that's how you had to get approval to get engaged, approval to get in, to get married, and all this, or even approval to court, all those things. And amongst the moments when I get caught where emotionally I struggle, I don't struggle with that. It's just so refreshing to go back and, dear God, you were part of this relationship when it started. And we've enjoyed that over the years. And because of you, there's a time coming, because in Christ we will see each other again. When I pass on from this life, I'm not going to join Carter, I'm going to join Jesus. But my blessing will be, my Carter will be there. So that's a bit of my story.
Pay attention, young man. This man's speaking some wisdom here, and certainly some encouragement that I don't think is very common in our time. You know, not only do you have the longevity of your marriage, but also the hope. Now you're coming to the part where you're separate from her, and I think that's a wonderful thing to share. Thank you, Colin.
The two things that come to mind is the first thing is that you had some 58-year-old letters. Was that right? 58-year-old letters.
58-year-old letters sitting in a trunk in the garage.
The best I can do is 23. Well, I might have 2 letters from the original. You know those letters you write your wife in the very early days of your relationship, and 50 years later you kind of look at them and go, "Oh, we were kind of
cheesy, very cheesy,
very cheesy." I don't know what it was like, back in your day, but certainly in the late 90s, early 2000s, I look back on them now and I go, "Ooh, I love you," but those letters are a bit funny.
Bit boys to men,
Yeah.
No, look, I've not shared them with my family at this point in time, but there's nothing in those letters that would give me any hesitation. And when I'm not here, my advice to them will be, you should read these. You need to read these, because then you'll understand some of the things you've seen, because this is where it began. And this is the foundation on which you had the blessing, as we did when you came along as our family. It was because of that centeredness in Christ. And now trying to match the dates. They didn't all have dates on them. Got the day written on them.
I mean, 1950s?
You're back into 1964.
64, okay.
But something on Monday, Tuesday or Sunday or whatever the day is on. So now I'm reading through the letters, trying to pick up what events are in this letter that I can find a date for.
Yeah.
Interesting fun. But
it's kind of a treasure trove, really. Like when I think about, I've had an experience where I was cleaning out Mum's home. She was moving, and I found this relatively large shoebox full of old family photos. And a younger me would have just kind of not really cared. But me today, I was so excited to go through those photos, and to think that you have these letters which give so much more information. That gives so much more context to what's going on. I mean, I'm slightly envious, of your family, that they'll be able to so intimately see some communication between yourself and your wife, and I just reckon anyone would be blessed to have that,
Comes back to that, like what is love, like when we're probably, at least, my experience when a young man, sort of late teens, early 20s, I don't really think you understand what love is, until you're much older.
Yeah.
Or at least it was from my experience, and the way you sort of captured that is, it's it's more than just that feeling when you're first getting together. It encompasses so many other aspects of it. Of love, when they talk about love being the actual ethic, it's like, well, that's all the other things are wrapped in that. Patience, kindness, love, forgiveness. All those things are wrapped in love, and there are bits and pieces of that are missing. And not even today's society, even in the church, I think we lose track of that commitment right till the end, through thick and thin. And that love is I've come to understand, and maybe you can share on that, is that sometimes and oftentimes love is sacrifice of self to the other person.
Look, it's a challenging thing, and I heard someone saying about relationships, and you needed to give up some of your own independence in a relationship. And I'm not quite sure that I would quite view it that way. But there is a degree to which you no longer are just suddenly totally self-motivated. There is a commitment. And my wife and I went into the marriage on the understanding this was the only time we were going to get married. So there was no alternative, no getting divorced and remarrying. It was, we're getting married, this is our commitment. And the privilege we had of working that through, and I'm so grateful for the wife my God brought me to know and to love. And she taught me things I still needed to learn. And as in most marriages, people are so different. Some couples are so different, like chalk and cheese, and you wonder, how does that work? And I've had the privilege of working with people in close quarters in children's work, and when we were in a boys' home with 3 family group home cottages with 3 married couples, each with 8 to 10 boys to look after. And each of those marriages was so different. And yet, as a manager, when I was assessing both them and their work, it worked. What they were doing in their structure of their unit worked. The children, the boys, had the opportunity of seeing how 2 people can love each other, how 2 people can be different and to share together, which in that sort of background, these kids came from broken homes, dysfunctional homes, and to actually have people who were so different and yet they were effective. And I think that's the point you were making in terms of, you learn, and the learning is in the context of who you're in relationship with. Now, be that the individual in a marriage, be it in a church context, there are things which are called for because of the context in which love is being expressed or needs to be expressed. And that's where the school of learning comes in. And I'm so grateful. I've been richly blessed to have been taught well. I came from a broken home. My dad was gone when I was 5. My mother was quite an amazing woman. Managed to keep us fed and clothed and all the rest of it. And it's probably where I got my interest in gardening from. I wasn't very keen on gardening those days, but veggies out in the garden and fruit trees in the backyard and chooks. I had chooks when I was a youngster. So I guess my introduction was there, even though I didn't learn what I might have at that stage, which is pretty common for young people. But the blessings, God knew where He was taking me. He knew what I needed to understand. There were some very difficult times, not so much as a marriage, but in work commitments, demands and appointments, which were very taxing, because some of those demands are not always fit your normal comfort zone. And when you're constantly put outside your comfort zone and you have to act responsibly, it's very demanding and can be costly health-wise, which it proved for me on one occasion. But God teaches. That's where love is a learning process. It's there is the warm, fuzzy sort of aspect we talk about in love and relationship, but that's, for want of a better expression, that's just the icing on the cake. And if you haven't got a decent cake underneath, what have you got?
Yeah.
Or friendship.
That's an awesome analogy,
Yeah.
Mum always sort of tried to teach me, son, love isn't an emotion. Love is an action,
Yes.
And I thought it was, man, I was so stubborn and stupid when I was young. I never really took it to heart, and I should have, because it would have jumped me light years ahead. But I have to say, God teaches us as he teaches us, and I wish I was more willing to learn earlier, but alas, I've arrived at this understanding that love is certainly not just that icing on the cake, So if I may ask, one of the things that I think people say about this time during COVID was that You know, there was no love in the healthcare system or the care, and I think the way the Bible puts it is, you know, hearts will wax cold. You know, the love of man will wax cold.
Yeah.
Don't know the exact scripture, but you know, you had this aversion of putting Carly into hospital, and it's not something that's unique. I heard of several other people that have done that because they kind of see it as a one-way road, or it's a one-way ticket, and the care might not be good.
I guess were you aware as well, you know, one of the reasons that you kept Carly home was because were you aware that once if she'd gone into the hospital system, you wouldn't have been allowed in there? Was that part of the reason?
Forced the vaccine, yeah.
That's part of it,
Okay.
because neither of us were vaccinated. I had a query very early in the whole so-called pandemic. And I heard, I don't know if we're supposed to mention names, but I heard someone in federal politics make some statements. I'm thinking, you're not answering the question. You're not answering it. You're whitewashing. And 3 critical statements. Can you catch it? Can you pass it on? Can you die? Yes, you can. Why should it have it? Because for everyone's good. How can it be for everyone's good if you can still catch it, you still pass it on, you still die from it? And that was my quickener to say, have another look. Have a good look. And that's where my journey really started on that one. It's when there's some difficult times, particularly over that time I was nursing Carly. But that started my query and wanting to know and understand. But on the question of love, it's interesting. Love is commanded in the Bible. It's commanded. How do you command an emotion? You don't really command an emotion at all. Emotions are subject to feelings, but love is a conscious action. I choose to love somebody. I choose to do something out of love. And I can weigh up the consequences and say, I'm going to do this. I'm making a choice. It's not a question of just how I feel good about it. I believe this is a thing I should do. Therefore, I'm taking action. And I believe that's what, coming back to your earlier comment about love, it's a very conscious decision that I will love, I will persevere, I will be willing to put myself out if need be. And I've been on the receiving end of that as well. So I've had the plus the awareness of God's love for me too.
And I'm just realizing now how much of a well of a lot of different subjects you could like just be on the depths. It's even a fringe thing to think of like long-term lifetime marriages. You know, even that is becoming more and more fringe. You know, the idea that a man is to stay with his wife, is to find the wife of his youth and stay with her, you know, not depart from her. You know, that's something that we're obviously seeing both in the church and in society, secular society. You know, we're struggling with divorce rates.
Well, divorce rates in the church are the same as in the secular world.
I believe so.
They're almost identical. Yeah,
which is like 50%, which is terrifying. You know,
and then you go to like just on a side note, you go to like India, especially traditional, Middle East, and the divorce rates are minuscule.
Yeah.
So even though we differ in our belief about gods, they very much, especially the traditional,
very monogamous. Yeah.
Well, but traditional India is like what they do actually understand this aspect of love, that it's about sacrifice. So I'm gonna seed that the church has done. I wouldn't say the church, but it's not great in the church.
I don't think the church did its job properly to defend the sanctity of marriage, and that isn't about like the whole same-sex marriage thing. It's more about the no-fault divorce thing, and supporting couples properly, supporting women properly, struggling in their marriages with abusive men, things like that. Like, and that in and of itself, Colin, you would know a lot more about. You know, your work in the Salvation Army, no doubt, exposed you to a variety of different relationships, children, and things. And I'm just like realizing now we shouldn't have. Like, it's not that we shouldn't have gone for a specific subject, but that there's so much to discuss. But
something.
This is more leading up to I guess, more leading into
Yeah.
our subject.
And
Just giving you a bit of a background.
you know, you've expressed to me that you believe there's a lot of worth, that you have a lot to offer with regards to talking about vaccine injury. And it's becoming a very popular subject since there's these court cases you're mentioning, the civil cases against I believe the government, federal government.
Federal government.
Yeah. So do you? I mean,
Do you want to sure tell us a little bit about, if you're open to that, tell us a little bit about your health first, and I guess leading from your marriage up until later in your life and your health, and I guess how your own health and your own health challenges have challenged you to think about medicine and science. And like you said before, you were listening to a certain federal subject talk about something and then not give a straight answer, and I guess how your own health has shaped your own thoughts about the last 3 years, and how that's made you dive a little bit deeper. Would you be able to share that with us before we get into the vaccine aspect of things, because that's important.
And take it how you will, brother.
Yeah,
Take it.
it's organic.
Look, the over the years, I mean, I mentioned earlier that I had a period which was extremely demanding when you're outside your comfort zone and you're making decisions. I was working with alcoholics. I don't like confrontation. But when you're managing a place like an alcohol rehabilitation centre, and you have to make decisions for the well-being of every resident, not just for one, and you can't give leniency to one and put the other, I forget what the number was now, but you can't put the other 30 or 40 at risk for the sake of one. If that guy has broken, and there were established grounds, they understood when they came in what the guidelines were, what conditions were to stay within the place, within the safety of the place. If you step outside of that, then you made a choice, and therefore you got to wear that. It's not for the rest of the residents to carry it for you, or to be put at risk because of you. And that sort of responsibility, and that took me to a place where I had a pretty amazing period in many ways, and again grateful for the opportunity of doing what I was able to do. And but it took me to the place when I left there, had lost so much weight. I was about 8.5 stone from 10.5, and it took me a couple of years to recover. And then needing to rebuild my body. My mind was still functional. I hadn't lost the mental capacity, but I no longer had the physical stamina. And conscious I needed to do something. And I was blessed because of a contact for a guy who worked in one of the army base in the local area, was happened to be belonged to the Salvation Army, and got me in to use some of their facilities, so I was able to do things physically. But becoming aware that, physical health isn't a promise in terms of you've been born, therefore you're going to be well. You do something, and the pressure of life, the pressure of work, tragedies, accidents, all these things have an impact. But then you're left with a choice, as I mentioned earlier. One day they want to put me in a back brace because of my back pain. And I wasn't prepared to do that because I could see if I took a back brace, my muscles would lose condition. And how could I maintain an active life if I went to a back brace? And I never did. Never needed to. Haven't got rid of all the back pain. Some of that you have to live with. But learned a lot of things along the way. Part of that process too was the health issue. Because of my state of well-being, loss of weight and so forth, I had a period where I'd be careful what I ate, bad digestion, terrible smelly wind and other things, and needing to deal with that, and had a doctor who was sussing out what things I was allergic to, and I guess many people have been down that path, and going back to a cleansing diet and then starting one food at a time. And if it played up, 24 without it, tried a second time. If it did the second time, you crossed it off the list.
Process of elimination, yeah.
Process of elimination. Drove my wife crazy. I ate something one day and the next day I wouldn't eat it.
So throw out the grocery list.
Honey, it's medical science.
As long as you throw out pumpkin, all right? I like pumpkin.
Sounds like you were a pretty strong proponent of if you don't use it, you lose it. You know, going back to your physicality side of things. You know, I was thinking.
Oh yes, I believe you need your physical health is not guaranteed, and while some of us are born with better capacity than others, some people are born more athletic, others are less so. But having said that, everybody's not supposed to be an Olympian. But you are supposed to be able to walk down the street. You are supposed to be able to play with your kids. You are supposed to be able to, if you want to go out and do some gardening or mow the lawn or something, you should be able to do that.
Like a level of functional health.
Functional health. Yeah. According to what the circumstances of your life are. But that doesn't come just as a once-off gift. We're given the gift of life to start with, and then it's a case of what we do with ourselves. We build our bodies up or we can help them deteriorate. And unfortunately, over the years we've been fed a lot of wrong information, and on many quarters. I mean, at a time, my wife used to comment from time to time, they used to tell us you can't eat eggs, now they want us to eat them. So those sort of observations.
The ham and eggs are good for you, one.
Were you I think it might have been 1950s. Oh, you probably remember when they encouraged pregnant women to smoke cigarettes. Do you remember that? Was that before your time?
Oh man, I remember those ads.
I can't remember that.
Yeah, pregnant women should smoke. I think that was I'm pretty sure it was 1950s. Someone's going to correct me, but anyway.
Yeah.
Yep. Because it basically what it did is it made the babies smaller so that when they pass through the canal, an easier birth. Yeah, amazing.
Might start saying the same thing about some other medical procedures. No.
Yeah, I got to lose some weight. Just start smoking. No.
Yeah, go down that rabbit hole. You open up a whole can of worms.
Yeah.
As to what the other things are involved.
Yeah. Did you So obviously you did your own research into your own health, your own things. Was this spurred on by your diagnosis, or was this before? Was this during Carly's time, or during what happened?
Oh no! Over the years, because I had the back pain was probably my introduction, and I wanted to function. I wanted to be able to move. I guess one of the things I look back with some gratefulness when I was in children's work, if a boy was going to run away, as a manager I had to make a decision. If I ran after him, I had to come back with him.
Yeah, yep.
Because if one got away, they saw me go after him, they knew, well then we can do it too.
Yeah.
And if I thought I couldn't do it, I didn't run. But having said that, I could outrun most of the kids of the Cubs and Scouts. I could outdistance them, and whilst I wasn't perhaps the fastest runner, I could outdistance most of them.
Yeah. And
so I knew I had some capacity. So as those sort of awarenesses grow and you become aware of, well, I did, that there are certain things I'm capable of. I remember when I was, what would have been, 35, I think. I hit my first brick wall, health-wise and capacity-wise. Up until then, if I wanted to do it, I did it. Whether it was shifting a rock or doing something manual, I wanted to do it, I did it. I got to 35 and said, hang on a minute, I actually can't do this. I can't do this. And I was staggered to think, hang on a minute, what's going on? I can't remember. I thought I'm getting old. Or probably did. I don't know. I can't remember now.
Yeah, it's a pretty humbling experience when that happens. You know, when you realise you're not the spring chicken anymore.
Yeah.
I'm 35, and that has occurred to me a couple of times. I mean, I'm in very bad health, right? But I have to say, you know, the feeling creeping in. I mean, Jace, you struggle with this greatly, don't you?
Well, I've got no idea what you guys are talking about. I'm just numb whatsoever.
Jason actually has a pretty bad back injury.
I'm still pretty resilient.
Yeah, I won't go into it too much, but
you can steal my thunder. No, it's joking.
He'll want to talk about that at some point. But I guess what I'm asking is, do you I want to ask if you got into Dr. John Campbell or anything like that with regards to the sort of study on the COVID vaccines and stuff. And I know I'm pushing towards that a lot, but it's more like what made you really dive into this aspect of COVID? You know, because it wasn't big until it was pretty well known, and I get the impression you were very early on that that sort of bandwagon.
Look, it's probably a connection to my background because I work with children, I work with homeless men. It's part of the ministry side of my life. It didn't just involve me, it involved me in working with and for on behalf of other people. Now, for me personally, that it had a relationship. God had called me to do the work, so it's not just my own initiative. God had called me to do something, and I believe very strongly that the scriptures talk about do everything as unto the Lord. So you don't do something half-heartedly. You do it as unto the Lord. Being careful, and we were talking about love earlier, you don't do something because you're doing it for Christ and say you're doing it out of love. If you're doing it for Christ, you're not doing it out of love. If you're doing it out of love for the other person, you love them. Christ is the motivator and the capacity, but if you love them, you're not doing it because Christ would do it, you're doing it because you want to do it. It's a conscious decision. And that sort of motivation, and I think that's into the background of where I was coming from. As the connection between my wife's cancer run and COVID is fairly closely tied together. So there were dual things happening for me. But I felt I needed to try and do something.
Yeah, so you're saying it was you just really cared about people. You cared about people and you wanted to look into this. Is that what you're saying? Basically,
dear God, something bad is happening in the world in which I'm living. Something bad is happening in the part of the world in which I'm living. What's my role here? What do you want me to do? It was pretty obvious there are things I can't do. One, my computer capacity is not wonderful. Thanks to my daughter and son-in-law, I managed to scrape through on a lot of things. But it drove me to the point of wanting to know, and then I spoke with my neighbour. I was aware of vaccine injuries, and my neighbour was talking about getting vaccinated, and I tried to talk him out of it. He went ahead, and he had, I believe it's 3 minor strokes. He was fortunately still able to work. And it just made me aware that trying to help people with this is not going to be easy, because even when they're hurt, some of them still can't listen. And when you try and not tell them what they need to do, because that's not the answer, they need to be able to be given the help to find the answer they need. And that's not so much, you don't tell them what they need. You need to open up the way to help them find what they need, because the answer to this thing for people who are suffering with health issues is not what the doctor recommends. It's not what some specialty recommends. It's what you actually fact have been able to ascertain and see some hope in this for me. This might work for me. I should have a try. But it's something people do need to look at it, because there are some fairly simplistic things that are spoken about. There are other things that are quite in depth, and you could not undertake them without medical supervision. Because you're talking about the vitamin C's and the zincs and the where are we? Hydroxychloroquine and so forth.
Ivermectin.
Ivermectin.
Drugs that have been around for a long
time.
Long time.
Got a good record.
Great record.
Yeah. And when they were cut out in Australia, that's another ball game and another subject probably.
Can I just tap on what you were saying before, which was just before we started the podcast as well. You know, you've with your own Parkinson's diagnosis.
Yeah.
You've ignored, well, I guess had to ignore some of the things that your doctors tried to prescribe for you, and you know, from seeing your own improvements, would you say that your own research and your own, you know, looking into your own condition, how to get better, has also highlighted all the things that you see they're wrong with regards to these jabs that have happened and how people have been advised? Has that had an impact on how you viewed that as well?
Certainly has.
Could you tap into that a little bit for us?
Well, let me take it a little bit further back to start with. I work with alcoholics around Melbourne, the suburb in which I was working. The guys were off their alcohol, but they could do a round of GPs and pick up alternative drugs. So whilst they weren't drinking, they were still drug dependent. So I became critical, probably. How do you find a good doctor? Now, fortunately, actually, my GP today is the GP that was coming to the centre when I was the manager. He's still my GP today. And so it's been a long relationship. One or two short breaks, but a long relationship. But so we went back to there saying, well, there are doctors and there are doctors. Which then takes me to the case, there are specialists and there are specialists. When you can't start talking about COVID, there are those who advocate for it, those who advocate against it. And then so you go into the whole ball game, then, okay, how do I assess what they're talking about? For me, it was a case of exploring what they were doing, what they were using, and what evidence was there of the outcome of what they did. And probably for me, the key thing was not so much their academic qualifications. You're not just talking about one story, you're looking for verifications that what they're saying actually works. And because I don't have the medical background to go into highfalutin papers and articles and scrutinise material, I can't do that. But like everyone else, I have eyes, I can see, I have ears, I can hear, I can observe, and I can take in. And some of the things I have learnt, most of them in America, I don't have any equivalents in Australia. Some pretty amazing results of people who said we are not following the status quo, we are stepping outside of it. Now that goes back to my Parkinson's, when you asked me about Parkinson's. With Parkinson's, inside the box is you're going to get worse and worse and worse, and you're debilitated, and eventually you're probably going to need to be cared for. And that's the general model. And then when I went for my neurologist, the answer was medication. But what else is there? Medication. And I struggle with that. I'm not saying, I won't take medication, because I will. If I get a situation where there's no alternative I can see but to take something, I take it. And if there's a consequence to it, then that's what it has to be. But if I can see a better way, what I consider a better way, a safer way, I do. That's been one of the thrilling things in looking at what's happening with COVID. The number of people I've listened to, and the different stories I've heard, and the people running very intense program, doing a lot of serious research, saying God has put into your body what your body needs to be able to heal, but you need to cooperate with what your body can do. God has already put it there. A lot of the medications don't do that. They override. They're symptomatic treatments. And with Parkinson's, that's what you're talking about. You're not curing the disease, you're treating the symptoms.
Isn't that the medical industry?
That's the medical industry.
In a general sense.
That's the whole medical industry.
Nurofen,
yes.
Could be diabetes drugs.
Yep.
Especially secondary diabetes.
I think the expression I heard once, and I could be using it out of context, is that our healthcare system is reactive, not proactive. I think
Yeah.
is how it
Yeah.
was worded to me once.
Well, just think of what
Or preventative.
Just as I was saying before, just think of all the drugs you can think of from statins, heart medicines.
Oh man, statin nation.
Diabetes, for example, people get type 2 diabetes is reversible. I'll talk about not type 1 but type 2. Nurofen, or any drugs that you get over the counter, they're treating the symptom.
I think it's type 1. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
Type 2.
Yeah, well, I've done type 2. I've been borderline on type 2 for quite a few years. But it's been diet, exercise, learning to relax, doing things physically I've not gone over the line. My family have. Other family members have been seriously affected. Not so much my present generation, but my mum and brothers and sisters have paid dearly with that. So I'm conscious, again, your earlier question about becoming aware. I know I can do things that affect my physical well-being. And with this research I've done, to hear these people saying, look, we do need to do this with great intent. We need to assess what we're doing, to carefully document what we're doing. We need to know that we're not over-prescribing, whether it might be vitamin C, which they use to great value in some programs. Knowing how much to give, when to give it. This is not guesswork. They're strategizing what they're doing. And but their comments coming back, God has put into your body what you need to heal. So if you give your body the opportunity to eradicate the poison, in this case the protein, and there's a way to do that, then you need to regain your well-being before you can start to rebuild and become healthy again. So you get past the unhealthy stage, back to the stage where you start to rebuild your health, and eventually come back to the stage of being healthy once again. But it's just been delightful to hear very competent people saying, God has put into us what our body needs. Now, on the same line, I mean, we all know the women, when they're having children, they'll have a craving for chocolate or something else. It has a part.
Lemons, onions.
Yeah.
Jules loved apple juice, man. She survived on apple juice.
Yeah. But it all has a part to do with the body saying, I want this. I want this. And when we cooperate in a deeper sense, even in recovery from COVID injuries, our body has needs. Becoming aware of what those needs are is part of the key, but then that needs help. Because I don't think I can get there on my own. As I've looked around and I've worked with my Parkinson's, I'm aware that you have to look, read, listen, assess, and then at some point you do have to make a choice. Do I continue the way I am? And for me with Parkinson's, that was to get with my GP told me of a friend. And this is my GP. He was on medication. The doctor was caring for him, changed his medication, and he went down the tube from that point. He never recovered. I mean, my GP's told me that at least twice. This is my GP, someone diagnosed with Parkinson's. He's telling me the story, which has given me the picture of, well, that's what you can expect at some point. You can go down a gurgler. But then one thing in my neurologist's favour was he's the one that suggested my physiotherapist. And this one's been amazing. Just simply in not accepting the status quo as being the end of the conversation. Look at the alternatives. Explore them. And if they make some sense to you, try them. Try them. And I think with this COVID thing, and my concern for people who are vaccine injured is that, one, they need to have the opportunity to know what the possibilities are. What can I do with this? And then, what am I prepared to do? So there's a case of information they need, and then at some point they have to make a jump. I either stay as I am, And if I do, as with my back brace, if I'd taken the back brace, I would never have done what I've done in my life. The back brace would have finished me off in terms of my physical activity. Bearing in mind I worked with children for so many years. You don't chase boys with your back brace on.
Well, because it just speaking from a place of backs, essentially what the back brace does is it stops you from creating the muscle to actually brace your own spine and brace your own back. So it becomes like my mum used to wear these girdles. They called them girdles, and they'd basically come around here. Now, to a point, they can support the lower back, but the actual cure is movement. The actual cure is movement, even if it's very light, to sort of rebuild those muscles and that core strength. And so I have no disrespect for the doctors over the years and the surgeons. And to be fair, I'm sure many of them look back and, much like ourselves, with ideas that we learn over time, they relearn things and they go, I would have done that differently. I don't know. And so there's, for some doctors and medical professionals, I believe there's a learning process too. They're doing at that time what they believed was best for individuals. So I don't hold any grudges, but certainly you learn things for yourself, and you learn, well, that was interesting.
I think also what you're saying is true, where we have a level of self-responsibility. Like, I think a lot of our time, like a lot of people in our time, sort of go to the doctors and they put all their trust in what a doctor, a GP might say, what a surgeon might say. And if anything goes wrong, they immediately, and sometimes justifiably, blame the doctor, when perhaps, after this incident, after this thing has happened, they've looked into it and they've realized, man, if I'd have just done a bit of research, if I'd have just looked into this, I would have been able to be more informed about this, So I do resonate with that. I think people are to be held accountable for the healthcare they decide to put their trust in, whichever way it may go.
Here's a question for us, right? So, within the medical fraternity, you talk about doctors and people that are going into medicine. Again, I don't want to blanket everybody here. I want to be very careful with my words. I believe
for the first time ever.
What's that? Yeah, for the first time ever. I'd like to believe that people who go into medicine, particularly, the level of GPs now is so low. People are not going to be GPs anymore. They're going to do other specialties. They're really struggling to find GPs. But in that practice, look, I've come across some amazing. Over the last 3 years, some amazing people who have stood themselves down from their jobs, have been suspended from their jobs, doctors, nurses, surgeons, that I've, who have said either no to the vaccine, or they just and been suspended as a result, or some who managed to dodge it and are still practicing, but just going into young people who are going into universities today. At least in my experience, especially with some of the younger doctors, even some of the ones my age, around the 40s and younger, I get the feeling that they're all reading from a medical book. It's like tick the box.
Yeah, it's been that way for decades.
Yeah, but I find it even worse now, and so I find it staggering that it's basically like great symptom here. Here's a drug. There's no, and there is an aspect of medicine that's changed with GPs too, because people don't stay there for generations. You're not seeing the grandmother, the mother, and then the son, and then the grandson. So you're not seeing that family history. So people move around a lot more. That's true. So you can't really see that. I don't want to say that doctors don't care. I think that would be, be wrong of me. But I get the feeling that it's just box ticking now.
Do you have? Okay, sorry.
No, go ahead.
So I have a family member who I love very much, and they literally don't believe in GPs. They're like, GPs aren't actually, like, if you go to a GP, they're just going to do a surface level diagnosis and give you like an over-the-counter drug. Like anything you would need to see a doctor for, a GP will identify and say you need to go to the hospital.
Well, it's what he said before. Remember how we were talking about a process of elimination? That's not so much done anymore. There's no process of elimination as much as there could be, or perhaps used to be.
Like my mum is, and to be clear, my mum is a very big proponent of Cody. You know, if the kids are sick, if there's something wrong with them, take them to the GP, take them and just make sure everything's okay. And I guess she grew up in a world where GPs might have been a bit different. I'm not sure. And they also, Colin, you have this relationship with this GP over a long period of time. I think that's very valuable as well, because they have a familiarity with with you, you know. Whereas I've seen, I don't have really a family doctor. Not since I was maybe 12 years old. And I see a multitude of different GPs when I need to, or when I need a medical certificate or something. And I find that most of the care that I get from them is I wouldn't say superficial, but it's like, oh, you know, I think I came in here with that conclusion. you know, I have something wrong with my eye, and I kind of already know what it is, or I have a.
And you're basically like I did during COVID. I had my tonsils out when I was like, I don't know, 20, 24 or 25. And so maybe once every 2 years, I get a really bad strep throat. So I know that there's bacteria there, and usually it's going to be amoxicillin or some psyllin. And so, you know, I rang the doctor in COVID. They wouldn't, you know, oh, do you have any symptoms of anything? I think I've got tonsillitis. Oh, well, you can't come in. Okay, no worries. So I rang up and said, great, I'll just have a phone consult. So I have a phone consult. Oh, I've got a really, really bad strep throat. Gave the history, and I just said, I want some amoxicillin. Oh, how do you know you've got strep throat or penis? It's like, well,
you came on too strong, man.
Well, you're not going to see me. No, I was quite
you
firm
made him
about
feel
it.
insecure.
I was quite firm about it. I said, well, you're not going to see me, so I've got to look at my own history, and this is what it was, and it went away. So after a while, you're literally going in and diagnosing yourself to the doctor, and he's just going, yep, I agree. Or what I'm finding now is that when I go to doctors, and I'm not trying to be egotistical here, but I literally will go in and I'll say, great, I want to sort this out, give me a referral, and then out of there, and I'm done.
There was actually a point.
I'm not asking for them, you know.
There's actually a point, and I'm not bashing on GPs.
Not at all.
That's not my position. That's one of my family members' positions. My mum obviously holds a lot of.
They still have a place.
Yeah, they still
100%.
definitely have a place. But there was a point during COVID where I would actually go to the doctor, and during the booking I'd say, hey, I just need to get a medical certificate. I've got to come in, and he was like, okay. So I'd come in, and he'd sit down, and he'd say, so what's wrong? I said, I just need to get a medical certificate for, and I'd go into symptoms, and he'd already be writing up the certificate. Like it was an interesting exchange, and I'd say something along the lines of, look, I've got a really sore throat. I work in a call center, so it's actually very difficult to talk. And then have a quick look, and then, you know, it was all done.
And the doctor went, oh, and he wrote the certificate and he walked out. Yeah.
But, you know, have you seen, like, in your experience, did you feel like your GP was being sort of pushed towards a certain direction when it came to advising you about whether or not you should take the vaccine?
Probably the advantage, my GP, to my knowledge, has not given anyone the vaccine, which is unusual to be in a position where you haven't done that.
How did he survive? No.
I don't really know the answer to that. He raised the subject with me at one point. That was very early in the piece, and I wasn't prepared enough to be able to take it up with him, so I really ducked having to answer him. But then he knows me well enough that if I'm saying I'm not going to do it, I'm not going to do it whether he says so or not anyway. Yeah. It wasn't a new relationship. He knew me, who I was. And so, yeah, look, I think the respect for your GP is important if it's going to work. If you don't really have respect for your GP, and if they're a stranger, even if they're a stranger and they're good, you still don't know. And you actually need to know that these people are trustworthy in terms of they are making an assessment and give me their honest answer. One of the things that's been quite amazing, looking at the people who have been very successful in treating those who've had what they call COVID and those who've had the reactions, is that they talk about, and particularly from the American scene, we have for years been responsible for our patients' health and well-being. How dare you take away our right to make decisions on behalf of our patients? You don't even know them. We do. That's been our role for years. That's what we've been doing. That's how we've ministered. That's how we've worked with people for years. And we're going to continue to do it. And they've bucked the system. And not all of them have survived, but many of them have. And there's some very positive things available on some of those protocols, which go to quite extensive lengths. No vaccination, COVID damage, what they call long COVID, and those sort of issues. There are different protocols now in place that you can follow up. You'd have to have some medical help in Australia to do it, because you're jumping America to Australia, and you've got to be able to come between the two countries with what's available and not available. Although things are becoming better here now than what they were not so long ago. And there are some, I don't know how much I should say on here, but there are some alternatives that are worth exploring if you hit a brick wall. But they're probably things people need the opportunity to say, well, that might be what you're told, but go and do some, here's a place, go and do some homework. Go and have a look and see what the alternative is. Because there are alternatives to a lot of the stuff that's around. And even when they've blackmailed stuff, there are alternatives to those.
I guess I have two more questions for you, just for tonight before we wrap things up. And the first is in regards, so I don't know many, so if you don't mind me saying, many 80-year-olds who have created their own websites. But is your website up and running?
No, it's still not up and running. I'm not quite sure I'll really get there, but I think people more able than me are putting stuff up. What I've come up to, where the place I'm really at now is trying to establish the links that I think are worth people following through. So my contact with people, if they've been vaccine injured particularly, is to say, okay, there are some practical things I can share with you, but these are the websites you need to go to. Look these up. Some of them are far more involved than others, and I don't know the answer as to why the different degree of complexity in some of the things. And I say complexity because you need to know, if you say increasing your vitamin C, how much vitamin C and how quickly. Because they're obviously, if you have it intravenously, you can have enormous doses, but you're under medical care to do that. You don't do that at home because it has to be monitored. So there are some circumstances you actually have to be in a medical facility with people who knew what they were working with, who could monitor the system and therefore know where you were at and therefore what your dose had to be next time, rather than something drastic happening in the course, not enough or too much. There are other things you can do at home.
We briefly sort of touched on this. We haven't really gone into it. Sort of was a topic and we kind of went elsewhere. But vaccine injury itself. So, I mean, my first-hand experience on a personal level with individuals with vaccine injury, ranging from heart attacks to death to pericarditis to not shingles, to Bell's palsy, levels of strokes, all sorts of, at a personal level. And then there are so many websites where the documentation of vaccine injury is just so obvious. And I know we're not going to have too much time to get into all the specifics, but for people out there who are listening, I mean, it's there. And so what thing I want to say is there's a couple of things in there. There's when someone you can have two types of reactions. A lot of people who have been vaccinated, have been jabbed with these jabs, and they haven't had a result, and they're perfectly fine, at least for now. We have had a lot of sudden deaths, so people just die. That's one of the most scariest ones. But a lot of people out there who have had jabs, they're like, well, my friends are fine, my family are fine, everyone else is fine. So we kind of have this cognitive dissonance, where it's like we block out all this negativity, even though and even though we've got this sense that, hang on, this was wrong, but it's like a blocking it out. I find that's one of the biggest obstacles to getting people more involved, even if they weren't, particularly if they were vaxxed and they're not having an issue and they don't know anyone who's had issues. But they don't want to get involved, even though they see, thousands and thousands. Now we've got the excess deaths in the UK, in Canada, in Australia, excess deaths on the grass between, and this thing this is now being documented now. And I guess, outside of your neighbour, are you aware of others on a personal level?
Well, one in particular, again, another 80-year-old. She had, I believe it was 2 vaccinations on the second one. Shortly afterwards, she got into real difficulties. She couldn't, she was living on her own, couldn't walk to the bathroom. She'd have to crawl to the bathroom, crawl to the toilet. Rang the doctor said take some Panadol or something like that.
Within a very short space of time of having the second vaccine.
Have the second vaccine.
Yep.
She managed to go to some rally somewhere with another friend, and someone who had been, I take it, was a doctor who'd been, what they call it when they just wipe out this, they can't practice anymore, not allowed to practice anymore, and he made an expletive, asked what had happened to her, and told her to take a particular supplement, and as soon as possible. She went home, she took that, and I can't remember the exact time, but I think it was within days she was beginning to function again, and she finds that she needs to continue to take it to maintain function. But she's quite active again. She's an 80-year-old, and she's helping other people. But when they come to her, she says, well, look, this is what I've done. This is why I did it. This is a product. I'll share some with you. But don't bother coming back to me if you haven't tried it. If you're not willing to try, I can't help you. There's nothing I can do. If you're willing to try, this is worth a try. And I think that's the beginning point for people. The prospects of being seriously ill is so high. Prospects of people still dying is still very high, particularly if some of the information we're seeing coming through as to the possibility of 2 to 5 years down the track.
And we already have fertility issues in the Western world, even in the Asian countries where the fertility rates are below replacement, and now we've got these excess deaths, and on top of that as well. It's I don't think people realise.
This is on top of the already massive dietary issues in the West, the huge issues of different basically pollutants that are being introduced into our diets, and I guess. It's funny, Jace, I have so many anecdotal points of vaccine injury. I've never really talked to you about it, but just very quickly, I was in a team at work of 12 people. In my team at work of 12 people, 2 people were hospitalised after taking the, it wasn't the Moderna, what was the other one?
So AstraZeneca.
AstraZeneca, AZ. After they took AZ, 2 of them were hospitalised. And I mean for like 2 weeks. And one of them in particular that was hospitalised was literally told by the nurse, like, we're not sure what's going to happen. And she said, am I going to die? Am I going to die? And they wouldn't give her an answer. It was terrifying, she said. For 2 days in particular, she thought she was going to die.
Every single person I know that's had AstraZeneca or any of those vaccines, for 2-3 days they were really sick. And the line was, oh yeah, you'll get flu symptoms and you'll be really sick, but you'll come right. Almost everyone I know in my close vicinity, they are now sick with flu-like symptoms almost every 3 to 4 months.
Yeah.
For a good 4 days.
Look, I know we're not doctors and we don't have, credentials and but we have eyes, we have ears, we have brains.
How is science done?
Yeah. And I'm not
Observation.
Yeah. And honestly, like, I'm not trying to draw a very strong conclusion just from my, anecdotal personal points of data, but I mean, when you look at what the TGA released about the information, at least in Australia, about the risks and the vaccine injuries and the reported impacts, it's quite scary, because they had that information, they had that when they were mandating it. You know,
yeah.
But look, honestly, I don't want to keep you too late, Colin, brother. I don't want to keep you too late.
I want to sorry, brother, to go on.
All good.
There's two things that come to mind. Just a lot of things you've been talking about. One of them was about GPs now having to relinquish their role in guiding their patients towards care, and now it was in the government's control. Well, as of next year, provided all our governments sign up to it, that's going to be the WHO's job. As of the new regulations coming out.
Oh, yeah, man.
Signing up. So basically, it will be, the rules are changing, and almost all the governments are signing on board with this, especially Australia, which we already knew. It was debated in the UK Parliament just on 2 weeks ago. It was 150,000. I forget the constituency in London, but it was 150 individuals signed up to basically get it debated in the UK Parliament. And basically the WHO Pandemic Treaty for next year, if all the governments sign on to it, it won't be our own federal governments making that decision. The WHO will say, well, there's a risk of something happening, so you've got to do this. So we're taking those powers away. But just lastly, going back to about April of 2020, when this whole thing started, and we had these big discussions in our home. I want to get to the heart of the matter here. Forget about nobody who's listening to this has to be a scientist to understand there was something wrong. When you look at the source of all the information that came out, and the source of all the information predominantly came from pharmaceutical companies at the behest of our governments. So when you look at companies like Pfizer, in particular, who have already been fined $2.1 billion, give or take, but going back into the early 2000s, wrapped up into the thalidomide incidents of the 1970s. Is it 1970s? And we look at these institutions that were already untrustworthy. I break it down really simple for people. If I had a friend who had a friend, and my friend suggested that I go through that individual to build my house, but I knew that individual had already been done for fraud, and big fraud, ripped off a whole lot of people in the past, and had been fined for it, maybe gone to jail. And now my friend's telling me, yeah, but don't worry about that, just trust me. He's a great person, he's a great individual. What should my first instinct be?
Rejected.
Huh?
Don't go that way.
Don't go that way. So I have had to break that down really, really simple. If I cannot trust the source, why should I trust the information? And that was it for me. So April of 2020, I made that decision. And the other one was viruses. What do viruses do? They mutate. They mutate. You can't vaccinate against them. They mutate, they change. So my question right there was, okay, how many times are we going to have a vaccination? This is before I knew where it was going, and it went exactly where I thought it would go. It would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So, when you talk about just using thoughts, and like I'm just a lowly peasant. I really am. Like, there are people who I would consider academically smarter than me who got vaccinated, who went along with this. And I sit back and I go, you guys, you're people that I looked up to. You're people that I looked up to for wisdom and for discernment. And you rolled up your sleeves, and look where it's got us. So you just reminded me of some things with regards to GPs and control, and just that lack of care that they were able to provide. So sorry to bang on there a little bit, but I started to get passionate about this stuff.
There's one word which just comes into what you're saying, and that has nothing to do with your academic qualifications. That's the word common sense,
which is uncommon.
Should
be called uncommon sense.
Is it one word though? Isn't that 2 words?
Well, whatever.
Common sense should be called uncommon sense, because it's uncommon.
Yeah.
So Jason,
and that's not education. That's
indoctrination. Wait, what? Common sense?
Common sense is some inner response we have to saying that doesn't add up.
Yeah,
it doesn't add up.
Yeah.
You say, well, back in my Christian walk years ago, when I was a young fellow and trying to work out what am I allowed to do, what can't I do, etc. as a Christian. And a verse of scripture was stuck in my mind, and I made my own phrase for it. Well, if in doubt, go without.
Yeah.
If in doubt, go without.
Yeah, it's a good rule.
And the same thing applies with a lot of other things. If in doubt, why jump in?
Rule it out.
Yeah, rule it out.
Yep.
You should be.
I
A
like
rapper.
that. I like that.
Hmm.
Well, Elijah over here thinks I'd make a great Christian rapper.
Yeah. So
We won't go there.
just quickly, I agree. I think very, very touching anecdotally on something. The little boy Sammy in our church.
Yes.
Yeah, he was in a bad way. He had cancer. We're talking, I was 1 or 2, I think. I can't remember when he was diagnosed. And his parents, they stood firmly on a couple of different positions, positions that the physicians were saying were like they were silly, like if they did that. And man, if you saw that boy today, you would not think he ever had cancer. Like this little kid has grown up strong, and they changed his diet. To put it very briefly, they cut out sugar. They said keep vaccine stuff away from him. They did a lot of different things that the doctors considered alternative, and he's doing well. And
It's amazing, isn't it,
bro?
But I'm being it sarcastic. It's amazing, isn't it? They did all these alternative things, and he got better. Wow.
Well, I would say that was a case where they did their research and they decided to take a different path. And I think everyone has that responsibility. But Jason, what's the most important question tonight that we can ask Colin?
Am I allowed to smile while I answer this one? And then Colin can smile. Colin, what is a woman?
We discussed this earlier. That's an in joke. So
That's not an in joke.
The real question is what, Jason?
I'm sure Colin knows. I'm sure you know the backstory to that question.
I've heard a few comments about it.
So it's like in all seriousness, Colin, what is the gospel?
The eternal hope that God has given us. We were not born into this world merely to live, to exist. We were born that we might have the opportunity to experience a spiritual transformation, to come into a relationship with God, and therefore to be able to receive the freedom that God has promised and given through Christ, to be able to attain. And we use that word with a caution. It's not that we accomplish it, but without God having done what he's done, we could never get there. But then having that relationship with God, and that's why we were born. The gospel has to do with coming to God's eternal purpose and finding the freedom to live the way God intended us to.
Hallelujah.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you so much. I suspect that you will be a recurring guest because, brother, you've touched on so many things that we could have dived very deep into. I'm mindful of time, just because it's late in the evening, and I must say, it's been a blessing and a privilege to be able to listen to you speak.
I mean, next time when you come on, you can bring some of that kiwi fruit. It's been growing in your backyard. I'm sure it's tasting mighty fine right now.
I had one last night that had actually fallen off the vine. The birds hadn't starred on it, and it was beautiful. It was soft. It already all ripened, which doesn't happen very often. It was on the ground undamaged, and it was simply beautiful. Kiwi fruit is soft to the touch and peels easily. Put it in your mouth, and it's
peels. You don't eat the outside. I love the fur.
I don't eat the skin.
I planted mine at my house, but they're a bit dormant now. It's a bit cold. So
yeah, they're losing leaves now.
Yeah, they'll lose their leaves, but we'll come back in spring. So you
So
come
they
around
will.
and have a look.
Yep.
Sign us off.
Be
Bye.
good.
You're listening to another episode of Fringe